The day I watched Linda Patterson from the HOA board walk out of my garage with my brand new snowblower, I knew I was dealing with someone truly special. Not special in the good way. Special in the way that makes you wonder how some people manage to function in society without getting arrested on a daily basis. I'm Wesley Drummond, and I'd been living in the Ridgewood Heights subdivision in Nashua, New Hampshire, for exactly 8 months when this whole mess started. It was February 2025, and we'd just gotten slammed with the kind of snowstorm that makes you question your life choices about living in New England. 18 inches had fallen overnight, and the temperature was hovering around 15 degrees. My driveway looked like someone had dumped a mountain of powdered sugar on it. I'd splurged on a top-of-the-line Toro snowblower just 3 weeks earlier. It was a beast of a machine, cost me nearly $2,000, and I'd installed a GPS tracker inside it because I'm not an idiot. Living in a neighborhood where the HOA president has a key to everyone's garage because of some ridiculous bylaw about emergency access made me cautious. That GPS tracker was a tiny AirTag knockoff that I'd hidden deep in the engine housing, and it synced to an app on my phone. That morning, I'd been planning to clear my driveway as soon as I finished my coffee. I was working from home, had a video call at 9, and figured I'd handle the snow situation right after. But when I opened the door to my garage at 8:45, the space where my snowblower should have been was empty. My first thought was that I'd been robbed. My second thought was to check the Ring camera I'd installed in my garage, despite the HOA's complaints about it. I pulled up the footage on my phone and watched in disbelief as Linda Patterson, the 52-year-old self-appointed queen of Ridgewood Heights, let herself into my garage at 7:30 that morning using her master key, wheeled my snowblower out, and disappeared down the street with it. The audacity was breathtaking. I mean, I'd dealt with Linda before. She'd left 3 violations on my door in the past 8 months, one because my trash cans were visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection. Another because I'd planted flowers in my front yard that weren't on the approved vegetation list. The third was because my car was parked in my driveway at an angle she deemed unacceptable. But this was theft, plain and simple. I opened the GPS tracking app and watched the little blue dot that represented my snowblower. It was moving slowly through the neighborhood, stopping periodically. I zoomed in on the map and realized what was happening. Linda was using my snowblower to clear driveways, but not just any driveways. She was clearing the driveways of the other HOA board members. First, she stopped at 147 Maple Ridge Drive, the home of Patricia Connors, the HOA treasurer. The dot stayed there for about 20 minutes. Then it moved to 89 Oakmont Circle, where Gregory Miles, the board secretary, lived. Another 20 minutes. Then on to 234 Willowbrook Lane, belonging to Sharon Hendricks, board member at large. I sat there watching this little blue dot make its way through my neighborhood, clearing the driveways of the HOA elite with my $2,000 machine, and I felt my blood pressure rising with each passing minute. By 10:30, the dot had stopped moving. It was parked at Linda's own house on 456 Coventry Court, the largest property in the subdivision. I grabbed my coat, my phone, and my car keys. I was done playing nice with these people. The drive to Linda's house took 3 minutes. Her driveway, which was easily twice the size of mine, was perfectly clear. Not a single snowflake remained. My snowblower was sitting in her garage with the door wide open, and I could see Linda inside, brushing snow off her coat. I parked on the street and walked up her pristine driveway. "Nice morning for stealing, Linda." She turned to face me with an expression that could only be described as practiced innocence. Linda was the type of woman who wore pearl earrings to check her mailbox and had never met a blonde highlight she didn't like. "Wesley, what are you talking about?" "My snowblower, the one sitting in your garage, the one you stole from my garage this morning." "I didn't steal anything. I borrowed it." Borrowed implies permission was asked and granted. You used your master key to break into my garage and take my property without asking. Linda crossed her arms. She was wearing a cream-colored North Face jacket that probably cost more than my snowblower, and her expression suggested that she thought I was being unreasonable. As HOA president, I have the authority to access homeowner property in emergency situations. Snow removal isn't an emergency, and you don't have authority to steal my belongings. The HOA bylaws clearly state that in weather emergencies, the board has broad discretion to ensure neighborhood safety and standards are maintained. I pulled out my phone and opened the GPS tracking app, turning the screen toward her. "I have a GPS tracker in that snowblower. I've been watching you all morning. You cleared Patricia's driveway, then Gregory's, then Sharon's, then yours. You didn't clear any other driveways in the neighborhood. You stole my property to provide free snow removal service to your friends." Linda's face went through several interesting color changes. "That's an invasion of privacy. You can't track HOA board members." "I can track my own property, which you stole. That's called theft, Linda. It's a crime." "I'm confiscating this snowblower until we can have a hearing about your hostile attitude toward the HOA board." I couldn't help but laugh. "You're confiscating my property because I'm upset that you stole it. That's your defense. You're being aggressive and unreasonable." "The board will hear about this. The police are going to hear about this. I have video footage of you entering my garage and taking my snowblower. I have GPS tracking showing you used it for personal benefit for yourself and your friends. That's theft, and it's probably conspiracy and misuse of your position." Linda's expression shifted from indignant to calculating. "If you call the police, I'll make your life in this neighborhood miserable. I'll find every single violation, every tiny infraction. I'll fine you daily. I'll make you wish you'd never moved here. So now you're adding threats and intimidation. This keeps getting better." I pulled my snowblower out of her garage and started walking it back down her driveway. Linda followed me, her voice rising. "You can't just take that. I'm confiscating it." "Call the cops if you think I'm stealing my own property. I'll wait." She didn't call the cops. She stood in her driveway, arms crossed, glaring at me as I loaded the snowblower into the back of my truck. I'd driven my Ford F-150 specifically because I knew I'd need the space. The snowblower barely fit, but I got it secured. When I got home, I did two things. First, I downloaded all the Ring camera footage of Linda entering my garage and taking my snowblower. Second, I downloaded all the GPS tracking data showing the route she'd taken through the neighborhood. Then I called the Nashua Police Department non-emergency line. The dispatcher was patient as I explained the situation. She said an officer would be by sometime that afternoon to take a statement. In the meantime, she advised me to secure my property and make sure Linda couldn't access my garage again. I spent the next hour changing the locks on my garage. The HOA bylaws be damned. I wasn't giving Linda Patterson or anyone else the opportunity to steal from me again. Officer Martinez showed up at 2:15. He was a young guy, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of tired expression that suggested he'd seen too much neighborhood drama. I walked him through everything, showed him the video footage, showed him the GPS tracking data. He took notes, nodding occasionally. "So she used a master key to access your garage. The HOA has master keys to all the garages. It's in the bylaws. Something about emergency access." Having a key doesn't give her the right to enter without permission unless there's an actual emergency. That's what I figured. And you're certain this is your snowblower? You have receipts, serial numbers. I handed him a folder I'd prepared. Receipt from Home Depot, credit card statement, product registration, photos I'd taken when I first assembled it. Officer Martinez flipped through everything and nodded. This is pretty clear-cut. She entered without permission and took your property. That's burglary and theft. The GPS data and video footage are solid evidence. I'll write up the report and forward it to the detective division. They'll probably want to follow up with you in the next few days. What about the other board members? She used my snowblower to clear their driveways too. That could potentially be conspiracy or receiving stolen property if they knew it was taken without permission. The detectives will look into it. Officer Martinez left, and I felt a small sense of satisfaction. At least the police were taking this seriously. I'd dealt with enough HOA nonsense to know that sometimes the only way to get these petty tyrants to back down was to involve actual authorities. That evening, I got an email from Linda. It was CC'd to the entire HOA board and came with a formal letterhead. Dear Mr. Drummond, this letter serves as official notice that you are in violation of HOA Bylaw 7.3.2 regarding garage security modifications. You have changed the locks on your garage without board approval, which constitutes an unauthorized structural modification. You are fined $500 and required to restore the original locks within 7 days. Additionally, you are in violation of Bylaw 12.8.1 regarding member conduct. Your aggressive and threatening behavior toward the HOA president is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. You are fined an additional $500. A hearing is scheduled for February 24th at 7 p.m. in the community center to address your violations and your continued pattern of non-compliance with neighborhood standards. Failure to attend will result in additional fines and potential legal action. Regards, Linda Patterson, HOA President, Ridgewood Heights. I read the email 3 times, each time getting angrier. Linda had stolen from me, and now she was fining me for protecting my property and defending myself. The sheer gall of it was almost impressive. I forwarded the email to Officer Martinez with a note explaining that this appeared to be retaliation for reporting the theft. Then, I started doing research. New Hampshire has pretty specific laws about HOAs. They can't fine you arbitrarily, and they can't retaliate against homeowners who report legitimate concerns or crimes. There are also limits on how much they can fine, and for what reasons. I spent 3 hours that night reading through state statutes and case law. The next morning, I called a lawyer. His name was Richard Klein, and he specialized in property law and HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Nashua, and he agreed to see me that afternoon. Richard was in his late 50s, with gray hair and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he'd seen every possible variety of human petness. I laid out the whole situation for him. The theft, the video evidence, the GPS tracking, Linda's retaliatory email. He listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled slightly. HOA board members seem to forget that being elected to a volunteer position doesn't make them immune to laws. Linda Patterson committed several crimes here. Breaking and entering, theft, potentially misuse of her position. The retaliation is just icing on the cake. What are my options? Several. First, you can pursue criminal charges. Sounds like the police are already involved, which is good. Second, you can sue her personally for theft and conversion of property. Third, you can sue the HOA for allowing this behavior and for retaliatory fines. Fourth, you can file a complaint with the state about HOA overreach and violations of New Hampshire statutes governing homeowner associations. What would you recommend? All of the above. These people need to learn that being on an HOA board doesn't give them carte blanche to violate laws and abuse homeowners. I'll draft a response to their violations letter explaining that the fines are illegal and retaliatory. I'll also send a demand letter to Linda personally and to the HOA board demanding compensation for the unauthorized use of your property and threatening legal action if the harassment continues. How much is this going to cost me? My retainer is $3,000. But honestly, cases like this often settle quickly once the other side realizes you're serious and have documentation. HOA boards are used to homeowners rolling over. When someone actually fights back with evidence and legal representation, they tend to fold. I wrote him a check. It hurt, but not as much as letting Linda Patterson get away with stealing from me and then punishing me for complaining about it. Over the next week, several things happened in rapid succession. Richard sent his letters. Linda responded with an email calling me a troublemaker and insisting that the HOA had done nothing wrong. Detective Sarah Chen from the Nashua Police Department called me and asked me to come in for a formal interview. I met Detective Chen at the police station on February 18th. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who clearly didn't have much patience for nonsense. We sat in a small interview room, and she had me walk through everything again while she recorded my statement. "I've reviewed the video footage and GPS data," she said. "It's very compelling evidence. I've also spoken with the other board members whose driveways were cleared. Their stories are interesting." "How so?" "Patricia Connors claims she had no idea that Linda was using your snowblower. She says she looked out her window and saw Linda clearing her driveway and assumed Linda was being neighborly with her own equipment." Gregory Miles tells the same story. Sharon Hendricks, however, got nervous when I pressed her. She eventually admitted that Linda had texted the board members the night before the storm saying she had access to a snowblower and would clear their driveways in the morning. So they knew. Sharon claims she didn't know the snowblower was taken without permission. She thought Linda had borrowed it with your consent, but the text message establishes that there was planning involved. Linda didn't just spontaneously decide to take your snowblower. She intended to do it before the storm even hit. That's premeditation. Exactly. Which makes this more serious than a simple theft. We're looking at burglary charges, theft, potentially conspiracy. The district attorney's office is reviewing the case now. What happens next? We'll probably issue an arrest warrant for Linda Patterson within the next week or two. The other board members are in a gray area. If the DA believes they should have known the snowblower was stolen, they could face charges too. But that's harder to prove. I left the police station feeling vindicated but also oddly exhausted. I'd moved to Ridgewood Heights because it seemed like a nice, quiet neighborhood. Instead, I'd ended up in the middle of a criminal investigation because the HOA president couldn't understand that other people's property wasn't hers to use. The HOA hearing was scheduled for February 24th, but Richard advised me not to attend. "There's a criminal investigation ongoing. Anything you say at that hearing could potentially be used in the criminal case. Let me handle it." Richard went to the hearing in my place. I stayed home, but he called me immediately afterward. That was one of the more surreal experiences of my legal career. "What happened?" Linda started by reading out your violations and announcing the fines. I interrupted and explained that I was representing you, that the fines were retaliatory and illegal, and that there was an ongoing criminal investigation into Miss Patterson's theft of your property. You should have seen her face. She turned the color of a tomato and started shouting that I was out of order and that the hearing would proceed as planned. What did you do? I handed her a formal notice that any further retaliatory action would result in immediate legal action and damages. I also informed the entire board that they could be held personally liable for allowing a criminal to continue serving in a leadership position while under investigation. That got their attention. Gregory Miles actually stood up and said that maybe they should table the hearing until the criminal matter was resolved. Patricia Connors agreed. Sharon Hendricks looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Linda overruled them and tried to continue, but at that point, half the homeowners in attendance were whispering and pulling out their phones. Someone asked Linda directly if she'd stolen your snowblower. She refused to answer. It got messy. So the fines are still in place. Technically, yes. But they have no legal standing, and I've already drafted a lawsuit against the HOA if they try to enforce them. I also made it clear that you've changed your garage locks for security purposes, which is entirely within your rights, especially after a board member committed burglary. They can't force you to give a key to someone who stole from you. 3 days later, on February 27th, Linda Patterson was arrested. I knew because I watched it happen, not intentionally. I was clearing my driveway of a fresh dusting of snow with my snowblower when 2 Nashua Police Department cruisers pulled up to Linda's house. Detective Chen and 2 uniformed officers got out and walked to her front door. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw Linda's expression through her front window. Shock, followed by anger, followed by what looked like panic. She came outside in handcuffs 5 minutes later and was placed in the back of one of the cruisers. By that evening, the neighborhood group chat was exploding. Someone had posted a news article from the Nashua Telegraph with the headline, "HOA President Arrested for Theft and Burglary." The article laid out the basic facts of the case, including my name and Linda's, and mentioned that other board members might be under investigation. My phone started ringing. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to wanted to know what had happened. Some were sympathetic, saying they'd always thought Linda was too controlling. Others seemed almost gleeful, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach and ridiculous fines. One neighbor, a guy named Tom from 3 streets over, told me that Linda had once fined him $200 because his kid's basketball hoop was 6 inches over the property line. The local news picked up the story the next day. A reporter from WMUR, the ABC affiliate in Manchester, called and asked if I'd do an interview. Richard advised against it while the criminal case was pending, so I declined. But the story ran anyway, with footage of Linda's house and interviews with other neighbors. The HOA board held an emergency meeting on March 2nd. I wasn't invited, but Richard was there as my representative, and he filled me in afterward. Linda was removed from the board effective immediately. Patricia Connors is serving as interim president. They voted to rescind all the fines against you and issued a formal apology for the incident. What about the changed locks? They're explicitly allowing it. In fact, they're offering to let any homeowner change their garage locks if they want. They're also modifying the bylaws to limit when master keys can be used. Turns out, several homeowners have been complaining about the master key policy for years, but Linda always shut down the discussion. Are the other board members going to face charges? Detective Chen told me that the DA's office decided not to prosecute them. There's not enough evidence that they knowingly received stolen property. The text message Linda sent was vague enough that they can claim they thought she was using her own snowblower or one borrowed with permission. I felt conflicted about that. On one hand, I believed Patricia and Gregory when they said they didn't know. Sharon was more questionable, but without solid proof, I understood why the DA wouldn't pursue charges. On the other hand, there's a certain willful ignorance that comes with not asking questions when something seems off. Linda's criminal case moved forward through the system. She was charged with burglary in the 3rd degree, theft, and misuse of her position. Her lawyer tried to argue that she'd had permission to enter my garage under the HOA bylaws, but that argument fell apart pretty quickly when the judge pointed out that HOA bylaws don't override state criminal statutes. In April, Linda took a plea deal. She pled guilty to theft and misuse of position in exchange for the burglary charge being dropped. She was sentenced to 1 year of probation, a $1,000 fine, and 100 hours of community service. She was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in New Hampshire. The civil case was simpler. Richard filed a lawsuit against Linda personally for conversion of property, seeking compensation for the unauthorized use of my snowblower, legal fees, and punitive damages. Linda's homeowner's insurance refused to cover her, arguing that theft isn't a covered peril. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a settlement, but Richard was firm. We went to civil court in May. The civil trial took exactly 3 hours. Richard presented the video evidence, the GPS tracking data, my testimony, and Detective Chen's police report. Linda's lawyer tried to argue that the damage was minimal because the snowblower had been returned, but the judge wasn't having it. Miss Patterson broke into Mr. Drummond's garage, stole his property, used it for personal benefit, and then attempted to retaliate against him for reporting the theft, Judge Morrison said. This is exactly the kind of abuse of authority that laws are designed to prevent. I'm awarding Mr. Drummond $15,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, plus attorney's fees. Linda's face went white. $15,000 plus legal fees meant she was on the hook for probably close to 20 grand. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. The HOA board underwent significant changes over the next few months. Patricia Connors served as interim president until the annual election in June, and she did a decent job. She was nowhere near as authoritarian as Linda had been. The master key policy was officially changed so that keys could only be used in genuine emergencies, like fire or flood, and homeowners could opt out entirely if they wanted. Gregory Miles resigned from the board in March, saying he wanted to spend more time with his family. I think he was just embarrassed by the whole situation. Sharon Hendricks tried to stay on, but she lost her re-election bid in June. Homeowners had long memories, and her connection to the snowblower incident, even if she wasn't criminally charged, was enough to tank her candidacy. I ended up running for a board position in that June election, mostly because I wanted to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. I won by a comfortable margin. Turns out, standing up to an abusive HOA president makes you pretty popular with your neighbors. My first act as a board member was proposing a comprehensive review of all HOA bylaws to ensure they complied with state law and didn't give the board excessive power. We spent 3 months working with a lawyer to revise the governing documents. We eliminated most of the ridiculous fines, narrowed the list of violations to things that actually affected property values or safety, and created an appeals process for homeowners who felt they'd been unfairly targeted. The new bylaws passed with 90% approval from homeowners. People were tired of the petty tyranny that Linda had embodied. They wanted an HOA that maintained common areas and handled necessary business without micromanaging everyone's lives. I ran into Linda once after everything was settled. It was August, and I was at the grocery store in Nashua picking up stuff for a barbecue. She was in the produce section, looking tired and older than her 52 years. Our eyes met, and for a moment I thought she might say something, maybe apologize, maybe try to justify herself. Instead, she looked away and hurried to a different aisle. I felt an odd mixture of emotions: satisfaction that justice had been done, pity for someone who'd let a tiny bit of power corrupt her judgment so completely, and relief that it was over. Linda and her husband put their house on the market in September. The listing described it as a beautiful property in a well-maintained neighborhood, which was technically true, but left out the part where the previous owner had been arrested for stealing from neighbors. They sold it in October for slightly below asking price and moved to Vermont. The new owners, a young couple named Amy and Jason, were friendly and normal. They came to their first HOA meeting in November and seemed pleasantly surprised by how reasonable everyone was. "We heard there was some drama with the old board," Jason said, "but everyone seems pretty chill now. We learned some hard lessons about the importance of accountability," Patricia Connors said. She'd been re-elected as president in June and was doing a good job. "We're trying to create a community where people actually want to live, not one where they feel policed." My snowblower, the innocent catalyst for all this chaos, was still working perfectly. I'd cleared my driveway probably 40 times since the incident, and I'd helped several neighbors with theirs. The difference was that I offered, and they accepted. Nobody took it without asking. The GPS tracker was still installed in the engine housing. I kept it there not because I thought someone would steal the snowblower again, but as a reminder. A reminder that protecting yourself isn't paranoid. A reminder that documentation matters. A reminder that standing up to bullies, even when they have a fancy title like HOA president, is worth the effort. I'd spent nearly $25,000 on legal fees by the time everything was resolved, even after the judgment against Linda covered some of it. The emotional stress and time investment were significant, but I didn't regret it for a second. If I hadn't fought back, Linda would still be running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, and some other homeowner would have been her next target. The story made the rounds on social media in the months after Linda's arrest. Someone posted about it on Reddit's HOA Horror Stories forum, and it got thousands of upvotes. A YouTube channel that covered bizarre legal cases did a video about it. I even got a call from a producer at a cable network that did shows about neighbor disputes, asking if I'd participate in a reenactment. I declined. I'd had enough attention. Life in Ridgewood Heights settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA functioned the way it was supposed to, handling landscaping of common areas, organizing neighborhood events, and dealing with actual problems rather than inventing violations. The board met once a month. Meetings rarely lasted more than an hour, and we focused on practical matters. In December 2025, we had our first annual holiday party since Linda's departure. The old parties had been stiff, formal affairs held in the community center with catered food and assigned seating. Linda had treated them like state dinners, complete with dress codes and speeches. Patricia suggested we do something different. We rented a local restaurant's back room, made it potluck style, and kept things casual. Over 100 neighbors showed up. Kids ran around playing while adults chatted and ate. Someone brought a karaoke machine, and we had impromptu singing. It was chaotic and loud and genuinely fun. Tom, the neighbor with the basketball hoop story, came up to me with a beer in hand. "I've lived here for 8 years, and this is the first time I've actually enjoyed an HOA event." Linda set a pretty low bar, true. But seriously, thank you. For fighting back. For not just accepting her bullshit. A lot of us wanted to stand up to her, but we were scared of the fines and the harassment. You showed us it was possible. We clinked our beer bottles together, and I looked around the room. People were laughing, relaxed, enjoying themselves. This was what a community was supposed to feel like. Not a dictatorship run by someone who got drunk on the minimal power of an HOA board position. My phone buzzed with a notification. The GPS tracking app, which I still had installed, was alerting me that my snowblower had moved. I opened the app, confused, and then laughed. I'd lent the snowblower to my next-door neighbor, Carl, earlier that day so he could clear his elderly mother's driveway. The blue dot was at her house across town. I showed Tom the app. "Want to see something funny? This is how the whole thing started." He looked at the screen, then at me. "You still have the tracker installed, call it insurance, or maybe a good luck charm. That little GPS tracker cost me $40 and ended up being the key piece of evidence in a criminal case." "Best $40 you ever spent?" "Absolutely." The party continued, and I found myself thinking about how quickly things had changed. 11 months ago, I'd watched Linda Patterson steal my snowblower and thought I was in for a long, frustrating battle with an unreasonable HOA board. I'd been right about the battle, but wrong about the outcome. I'd expected bureaucratic stonewalling and legal gray areas. Instead, I'd gotten clear evidence, serious criminal charges, and actual justice. It wasn't always that clean. I knew plenty of people who dealt with nightmare HOAs and never got resolution. People who paid thousands in bogus fines or gave up and moved. I'd gotten lucky in some ways. The GPS tracker had been a stroke of paranoid genius. Linda's decision to use the snowblower for multiple driveways, creating a clear pattern, had made the case stronger. The video evidence from my Ring camera had been perfectly clear, and I'd had the financial resources to hire a good lawyer, but luck aside, I'd done something important. I'd stood up for myself. I'd documented everything. I'd followed through even when it would have been easier to just pay the fines and move on. And in doing so, I'd changed an entire neighborhood for the better. As the party wound down and people started heading home, Patricia pulled me aside. "I wanted to thank you again. I know we've said it before, but I mean it. Linda's arrest was a wake-up call for all of us on the board. We'd been going along with her decisions because it was easier than arguing, and we told ourselves we were just following the bylaws. We were enablers. We let her abuse her position because we didn't want the conflict. You didn't know she was going to steal from me." "No, but we knew she was too aggressive with violations. We knew she enjoyed the power too much. We should have checked her behavior long before it escalated to theft." Lesson learned. I drove home that night feeling content. My house was decorated with Christmas lights that probably would have violated Linda's aesthetic standards, but that everyone else seemed to enjoy. My driveway was clear. My snowblower was securely in my garage with its new locks, and the GPS tracker was still faithfully reporting its location. The snow started falling again as I pulled into my driveway, fat flakes that caught the light from my porch. We were supposed to get another 6 inches overnight. In the morning, I'd fire up the snowblower and clear my driveway. Maybe I'd do Carl's too and offer to help the elderly couple 2 doors down, but this time I'd be doing it by choice, with my own equipment, without anyone stealing from me or trying to fine me for defending myself. And that made all the difference. The legal system had worked the way it was supposed to. A crime had been reported, investigated, and prosecuted. The guilty party had been held accountable. Justice, imperfect but real, had been served. Linda Patterson had learned that being HOA president didn't place her above the law, and an entire neighborhood had learned that fighting back against abuse of authority was possible and worthwhile. As I sat in my living room that night, watching the snow fall outside my window, I pulled up the GPS tracking app one more time. The blue dot representing my snowblower was back in my garage, right where it belonged. I smiled and closed the app. Some people might think keeping the tracker installed was paranoid, but I'd learned the value of documentation and preparedness. Besides, it was a good story. The story of how a $40 GPS tracker and a willingness to stand up for myself had taken down a petty tyrant and reformed an entire homeowners association. Not bad for an 8-month resident of Ridgewood Heights. I eventually wrote up the whole experience and shared it on a few online forums dedicated to HOA horror stories and legal advice. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people shared their own stories of HOA abuse, and dozens asked for advice on how to fight back against their own problematic boards. I gave the same advice every time. Document everything, know your rights, consult a lawyer, and don't back down when you're in the right. A few months later, I got an email from a guy in Colorado who'd used my story as a template for dealing with his own HOA president, who'd been misusing community funds. He'd installed security cameras, tracked the president's spending, and reported it to the state. The president was eventually removed and prosecuted for embezzlement. "Your story gave me the courage to fight back," he wrote. "Thank you. That email made everything worthwhile. The stress, the money, the time investment. If my experience could help even one other person stand up to an abusive HOA, then it had value beyond just my own situation." Life in Ridgewood Heights continued to improve. The neighborhood became known as one of the better-run HOA communities in Nashua. Property values went up, not because of strict enforcement of petty rules, but because people actually wanted to live there. The community had events that people enjoyed, maintained common areas efficiently, and treated homeowners like adults rather than children who needed constant supervision. I served on the board for 2 years before stepping down to focus on other things. By then, the changes we'd implemented were firmly established, and new board members understood that their role was service, not authority. The culture had shifted permanently. The snowblower eventually wore out after 5 hard New Hampshire winters. I replaced it with a new model, and yes, I installed another GPS tracker in that one too. Call it superstition or wisdom gained from experience. Either way, nobody ever stole the second one. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd wonder what would have happened if I hadn't installed that GPS tracker. Would I have been able to prove the theft? Would the police have taken me seriously? Would Linda have gotten away with it and continued her petty tyranny for years to come? I'd never know for sure, but I was grateful things had worked out the way they did. The story became part of Ridgewood Heights lore. New residents would hear about it during the neighborhood orientation, usually presented as a cautionary tale about the importance of accountability and transparency in HOA governance. Some people thought it was exaggerated or made up, until they met me or looked up the court records online. Then they'd realize it was all real, every ridiculous detail. Linda Patterson's name became shorthand in the neighborhood for HOA overreach. Someone would suggest an overly strict rule, and another board member would say, "That's a bit Linda Patterson, don't you think?" Everyone would laugh, and the idea would be dropped. Her legacy was serving as a permanent reminder of what not to do. I never saw Linda again after that encounter at the grocery store. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband had divorced a year after moving to Vermont. Apparently, the stress of the criminal case and the financial burden of the judgment had put too much strain on their marriage. I felt a twinge of sympathy when I heard that, despite everything. Consequences had caught up with her in ways that extended far beyond the legal system. But mostly, I felt relief that she was gone and that Ridgewood Heights had become the kind of community I'd hoped for when I first moved in. A place where neighbors helped each other, where the HOA served its legitimate purpose without becoming authoritarian, and where a snowblower was just a snowblower, not the centerpiece of a criminal conspiracy. The final chapter of the whole saga came 2 years after Linda's arrest, in February 2027. I got a letter in the mail from her lawyer. Inside was a check for $20,000, the remainder of the civil judgment plus accumulated interest that Linda had been paying off in installments. A short note was attached. Final payment per court order. Matter concluded. No apology. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing beyond the legal minimum. Just a cold, formal notification that her debt was paid and she was done with me. I deposited the check and filed the letter away with all the other documents from the case. The money had covered all my legal fees and then some, which was satisfying in a practical sense. But the real victory had never been about the money. It had been about standing up for myself, about refusing to accept that someone with a title and a master key could abuse their position without consequences. It had been about changing a community for the better and showing other people that fighting back was possible. I kept the GPS tracker from the original snowblower in a drawer in my office. Every time I saw it, I remembered that sometimes the smallest precautions can make the biggest difference. A $40 device had been the key to everything that followed. It had documented a crime, supported a prosecution, and ultimately helped reform an entire homeowners association. Friends would visit and see it on my shelf, and they'd ask what it was. I'd tell them the story, usually in abbreviated form, and they'd shake their heads in amazement. "I can't believe your HOA president actually stole your snowblower," they'd say. And I'd laugh and reply, "Neither could she when the police showed up at her door." The story had a happy ending, which is rare in HOA disputes. Most of them drag on for years, draining money and energy with no clear resolution. But this one had ended with justice served, a community improved, and a cautionary tale that would be told for years to come. Linda Patterson had tried to use her position to take advantage of a homeowner, and instead, she'd lost her position, her reputation, and a considerable amount of money. As for me, I learned valuable lessons about documentation, persistence, and the importance of fighting for what's right even when it's difficult. I learned that laws exist to protect people from exactly this kind of abuse, but only if you're willing to use them. I learned that sometimes the best investment you can make is in a good lawyer and a cheap GPS tracker. And I learned that a snowblower, properly tracked and documented, can be the key to taking down a tyrant, which is probably the most bizarre and satisfying lesson of all.